Welcome, everyone. This is an introduction to U.S. federal government contracts and compliance solutions in a nutshell, courtesy of Dynamic Contracts Consultants. To start off with, we ask the question why you should venture into government contracts. Opportunity, for one. There are approximately 30,000 open requisitions for federal, state, and local agencies on a daily basis. Business diversification is good. Federal agencies pay within 30 days of proper invoice. There are provisions in the federal marketplace that make it easy for small and small disadvantaged business to compete. Federal agencies are motivated to award contracts to help small business as well as other socioeconomic groups. Now, what sort of things does the U.S. federal government buy? Well, it's items like pencils, dirt bikes, kitchen tools, antenna cables, IT services, construction services, engineering services, jets, batteries, and all of the above. What is the U.S. federal government procurement threshold? From micro purchases from $0 value to $25,000 in value. The U.S. federal government buys with no competition. Purchases are often made with a government purchase card, and there varies. From the micro purchase threshold to $25,000, based on the RFQ, the U.S. federal government buys either by phone or writing an email to the vendor directly. For all the requisitions, about $25,000 must be posted on fbo.gov. Now, for micro purchase threshold to $150,000, these would be automatically set aside for small business unless exception can be found, such as an emergency. How can Dynamic Contracts Consultants help you? We can assist you in finding opportunities to bid, interpreting solicitations and regulations, certifications and registrations, marketing to government buyers, and more, finding subcontractors, and coordinating efforts for subcontracting. What are the competitive advantages, and what do we mean by competitive advantage? The federal government has goals to purchase from small business. That means that up to 23% of all prime contracts are legislated to be allocated for small businesses. The federal government stipulates that all contracts between purchase card threshold and $150,000 are automatically set aside for small business. And socioeconomic minimum goals basically comprises 5% of these contracts for small disadvantaged business, 5% of contracts set aside for women-owned small business, 3% for Hub Zone certified firms, 3% for service-disabled veteran-owned small business, and 8A certification, and disadvantaged business enterprise goal for federally funded transportation work. What are subcontracts, and what are the advantages for being a subcontractor? Small business and socioeconomic goals are passed down to large prime contractors. They must submit a subcontracting plan, outline the percent they will sub out to socioeconomic groups and small business. For example, let's say XYZ Construction Company owned and procured a contract to build 2 barracks in San Antonio for $25 million. 70% of the contracts will be set aside to small business. 7% of the contracts will be set aside for women-owned small business, and 10% for Hub Zone. What are the contracting basics? They are as follows: contracting officer, contracting fundamentals, contracting process, and how to read a contract. So, what is a contract? A contract is an agreement between 2 or more parties, which is enforceable by law. It can be either written or oral. it must contain the following 5 elements, such as offer, acceptance, it must be for consideration, it must have a legal objective, and the parties must be competent enough to enter into an agreement in a contracting obligation. The U.S. federal government contracts are basically governed by FAR, which is known as the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The FAR is the primary regulation for use by all executive agencies in their acquisition of supplies and services with appropriated funds. The Federal Acquisition Regulation is established for the codification and publication of uniform policies and procedures for acquisition by all executive agencies, to administer or terminate contracts and make any changes to the contract. So who has the authority to enter into a contract? Only contracting officers have authority to enter into, administer, or terminate contracts and make changes to the contract. Contracting officers may bind the government only to the extent of the authority delegated to them. Contracting officers must ensure contracts are in compliance with all laws, executive orders, regulations, and all other applicable procedures. Contracting officers appointed by way of a warrant with dollar limitations. So let's now go over the various contracts. What are the types of contracts? Contract types basically are identified as simplified acquisition procedures, sealed bidding, contracting by negotiation, types of contracts, and special contracting methods, as well as emergency acquisitions. How does the government select contracting type? There are a number of different types of contract options available to the government and contractors in order to provide the flexibility required to support the variety of needed supplies and services. Contract types may vary according to the level of risk assumed by the contractor for the costs of performance and profit incentives offered to the contractor for achieving or exceeding specified standards. What is contract negotiation? Contract negotiation basically is a matter of negotiation and requires sound judgment by the contracting officer. The objective is to negotiate a contract type and price that will result in reasonable contractor risk and provide the contractor with the greatest incentive for efficient and economical performance. Contract types are grouped into 2 broad categories: fixed price contracts and cost reimbursement contract. What are contracting fundamentals? The government is not liable for unauthorized acts of its employees. The contractor performs beyond the scope that is required by the contract without a formal change order, or it could originate from a government informal order, could be defined in words or deeds. Contracting officer may be primary source of unauthorized commitment or constructive change, or it could be for defective specifications and misleading information, and failure of the government to cooperate during contract performance, disagreement over contract requirements, and contract performance to be accelerated and accomplished prior to the scheduled date. Contracting fundamentals and ratification. Just what is ratification? Contractor may be liable for the cost involved if the action that is not ratified, it is the subsequent adoption of the unauthorized act. The process is time-consuming and lengthy that may involve justifications and approvals. The contracting officer must be diligent when instructing contractors and subcontractors to perform tasks or work outside the scope of the contract. Now let's discuss the contracting process. The process comprises 6 basic steps acquisition planning, solicitation processing, compliance, submission of proposals, evaluation of proposals and compliance, contract award, contract administration, and compliance. Let us briefly go over what is acquisition planning FAR 7.1. The process comprises conducting market research, determine acquisition strategy with a contracting officer, define and identify requirements, review statement of work or performance work statement, identify drawing specifications, and any compliance issues identified in statement of work and PWS, identify independent cost estimate for the proposal, identify any security requirements to be in compliance. What is the solicitation process to be in compliance? The contracting officer prepares and issues solicitation. Contracting officer will post a synopsis of the proposal, identify contracting and subcontracting opportunity if applicable, develop and identify documentation for the proposals, conduct site visits if necessary, identify compliance issues identified in the proposal and implementation process, obtain reviews and approvals from outside sources if applicable or desired. Evaluation of proposals and compliance. Contracting officer representative will evaluate contractor's proposals in accordance with the solicitation factors. Contracting officer may look for assistance from contracting officer representative for proposal evaluation. Price may not always be a leading factor for proposal analysis, provided it is a LPTA requisition. LPTA means lowest price technically acceptable requisition. Past performance is one of the major factors. Risk analysis plays a major role for mitigating risk. Compliance is always a major factor in proposal analysis to identify the issues and how will the contractor and its subcontractors comply and what procedures they will implement to be in compliance. Source selection and contract award. Contracting officer, in coordination of the efforts of contracting officer representative, will award a contract to the successful contractor in accordance with the policies and procedures with FAR. Contracting officer will select awardee in accordance with the solicitation factors and debriefs the unsuccessful offerers. Now let's move on to contract administration and compliance. Contracting officer representative will monitor contractor's performance, will monitor quality assurance, documents, past performance, subcontractors, compliance, options, modifications, risk analysis, and the contract closeout. So basically, how do you read a contract? What's the submission of a proposal? Well, to read a contract, you would first have to identify the contract number, order number, look for the effective date, contract office, view of the terms of discount, shipped to, administered by, the vendor, payment box under 18A, signature of the vendor, contracting officer signature, and date of award. It also includes quantity, unit of issue, unit price, CLIN structure, sub-CLIN, item description, rounding in PD2, funding by Akron, location of FOB information, and PR number. Contracting modifications. Contracting officer acting within the scope of their authority are empowered to execute contract modifications on behalf of the government. Modifications can be bilateral, supplemental agreements, or unilateral to make administrative changes, issue change orders, make changes authorized by clauses other than change clause, or issue termination notices. Contract closeout. A contract closeout is a process of declaring that the obligations under the contract have been satisfied and that a procurement file is both physically and administratively complete. A closeout can occur when the contractor's supplies or services have been accepted and paid for. All documentation on the procurement is finalized and properly assembled. A closeout can be termination for default, commercial contract termination, government contract termination, and excusable delay or force majeure. We thank you very much for watching, and if you have any questions, simply give us a call or email Dynamic Contracts Consultants, and we'll gladly get back with you at the earliest convenience.